What if a king, once hailed as a warrior, met an end so savage that it still haunts us over 5 centuries later? What if the final moments of his life were not just a defeat, but a brutal, blood-soaked spectacle that shocked even his fiercest enemies? Welcome to the dark and tragic tale of King Richard III of England, a monarch whose death on the battlefield was far more horrific than most can imagine. History often paints him as a villain, a usurper, a man cursed by deformity and ambition thanks to Shakespeare's infamous portrayal. But the truth of his final hours is a story of raw violence, betrayal, and a desperate fight for survival that ended in unimaginable carnage. Stick with us as we uncover the chilling details of a death that redefined the course of English history. A death so brutal, it left an indelible mark on the annals of time. This is not just a story of a king's follies, a descent into the darkest depths of medieval warfare, where honor was trampled underfoot and mercy was nowhere to be found. Prepare yourself, because what you're about to hear will shatter any romantic notions of royal battles. To understand the sheer brutality of Richard III's death, we must first step back into the turbulent world of 15th century England, a land torn apart by a vicious struggle for power known as the Wars of the Roses. This was a civil war that pitted 2 rival branches of the royal Plantagenet family against each other: the House of York, represented by a white rose, and the House of Lancaster, symbolized by a red rose. For decades, these factions clashed in a relentless cycle of battles, betrayals, and bloodshed, each side vying for control of the English throne. The stakes were unimaginably high. Kings were crowned and deposed, noble families were wiped out, and entire regions were plunged into chaos. It was a time when loyalty was fragile, and ambition often led to a traitor's blade in the back. Into this maelstrom of violence and intrigue stepped Richard of York, later Richard III, a man whose life was shaped by war from the moment he was born on the 2nd of October, 1452, at Fotheringhay Castle. Richard was the youngest surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville, born into a family already embroiled in the fight for the crown. His early years were marked by instability. His father was a leading Yorkist claimant to the throne, challenging the Lancastrian King Henry VI, whose weak rule and bouts of mental illness had destabilized the kingdom. By the time Richard was 8, his father was killed at the Battle of Wakefield in 1460, a devastating blow that left the Yorkist cause in disarray. Yet, the tide turned soon after when Richard's elder brother Edward seized the throne as Edward IV in 1461, establishing Yorkist dominance. Richard, still a child, was thrust into a world of court politics and military training, growing up under the shadow of his brother's reign. He was shaped by the brutal realities of power-witnessing executions, betrayals, and the constant threat of rebellion. Despite rumors of a hunched back or physical deformity, likely exaggerated by later propaganda, Richard proved himself a capable warrior and loyal supporter of Edward IV, earning a reputation for courage and ruthlessness in battle. As a young man, Richard was granted vast lands and titles, including the Dukedom of Gloucester, and he played a key role in securing the north of England for the Yorkists. He fought in pivotal battles like Barnet and Tewkesbury in 1471, where the Lancastrian forces were crushed, and Henry VI's son, Edward of Westminster, was killed. These victories cemented Edward IV's rule, but they also soaked the land in blood, deepening the hatred between the houses. Richard's loyalty to his brother seemed unshakable, yet beneath the surface, the seeds of future conflict were sown. The court was a nest of vipers, with noble families like the Woodvilles, relatives of Edward's queen, Elizabeth Woodville, jockeying for influence. Richard, though trusted by Edward, was often at odds with these factions, his northern power base and stern demeanor making him a polarizing figure. His marriage to Anne Neville, widow of the Lancastrian Prince Edward, further complicated his position, tying him to both sides of the conflict through blood and alliance. But the fragile stability of Edward IV's reign shattered in 1483 when the king died unexpectedly at the age of 40, leaving behind 2 young sons, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, aged 12 and 9. What should have been a straightforward succession turned into a deadly power struggle. Richard, as the boy's uncle and a senior Yorkist, was named Lord Protector, tasked with guiding the young Edward V to the throne. Yet, whispers of illegitimacy began to swirl. Rumors possibly fueled by Richard himself, that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, rendering the princes bastards. In a swift and ruthless move, Richard had the boys confined to the Tower of London, ostensibly for their safety, while he maneuvered to secure power. On the 6th of July, 1483, Richard was crowned King Richard III, a decision that stunned and enraged many, particularly the Woodvilles and their allies. The fate of the princes in the Tower remains one of history's darkest mysteries. Most believe Richard ordered their murder, though no definitive proof exists. This act, whether true or not, stained his reputation, painting him as a tyrant willing to kill his own kin for the crown. Richard's reign, though short, was marked by constant tension. He faced rebellion almost immediately, with Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian claimant exiled in France, emerging as a rival backed by disaffected Yorkists and Lancastrian loyalists. Richard's rule was a desperate balancing act, trying to consolidate power while fending off threats from within and without. He implemented reforms, such as improving legal access for the poor, which showed a pragmatic side, but his enemies branded him a monster, a usurper who had stolen the throne through bloodshed. By 1485, just 2 years into his reign, the stage was set for a final, cataclysmic confrontation. Henry Tudor landed in Wales with a small army, gathering support as he marched toward Richard's forces. The two would meet at Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, in a battle that would decide the fate of England and lead to a death so brutal it would echo through the ages. This is where our story begins to darken, where the threads of ambition, betrayal, and violence weave into a tapestry of horror. Richard III, a king who had fought his way to power through grit and bloodshed, now faced an enemy determined to tear him down. What happened on that muddy field in Leicestershire was not just a battle, it was a slaughter, a personal vendetta played out with steel and fury. But before we dive into the carnage of Bosworth, let's pause to reflect on the man at the center of this storm. Richard III was no mere villain or victim. He was a product of his time, a warrior, king shaped by a world where mercy was a luxury few could afford. How did it come to this? How did a man who once fought for his family's honor end up facing such a savage end? As Richard III sat uneasily on the English throne in 1483, the crown he had seized through cunning and ruthlessness became a heavy burden, one that seemed to tighten like a noose with each passing day. His coronation, meant to solidify his power, instead ignited a firestorm of resentment across the kingdom. Many nobles, particularly those loyal to the Woodville family and the memory of Edward IV's young sons, saw Richard not as a rightful king but as a usurper, a man stained by the blood of innocence. The mysterious disappearance of the princes in the Tower Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury cast a dark shadow over his reign. Though no bodies were ever found, whispers of murder spread like wildfire, turning public opinion against him. Richard's enemies painted him as a monster, a kinslayer who would stop at nothing to secure his grip on power. In a world where loyalty was often bought with fear, Richard found himself increasingly isolated, surrounded by courtiers who smiled to his face while sharpening daggers behind his back. The first major challenge to Richard's rule came swiftly, in the form of a rebellion led by Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, in October 1483. Buckingham, once a close ally who had supported Richard's claim to the throne, turned against him with shocking speed. Historians debate his motive. Some suggest he was disillusioned by Richard's refusal to share power, others that he sought the crown for himself. Whatever the reason, Buckingham allied with the Woodvilles and other disaffected nobles, plotting to overthrow Richard and restore the line of Edward IV, or at least place a more malleable ruler on the throne. Their plan was audacious. Coordinated uprisings across southern England, timed with an invasion by Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant who had been in exile in Brittany since childhood. Henry, though a distant relative of the royal line through his mother, Margaret Beaufort, represented a glimmer of hope for those who despised Richard's rule. His claim was weak, but his determination and the growing hatred for Richard made him a dangerous rival. Richard, however, was no stranger to treachery, and his response was swift and brutal. When Buckingham's rebellion faltered due to poor weather and lack of coordination, floods delayed troop movements, and many promised supporters failed to materialize, Richard seized the opportunity to crush his former ally. Buckingham was captured, tried for treason, and executed on the 2nd of November, 1483, in Salisbury. His head struck from his body as a grim warning to others. Richard's forces hunted down remaining rebels with ruthless efficiency, and for a moment, it seemed he had weathered the storm. But the rebellion had exposed a fatal weakness. His support base was crumbling. Even as he quelled the uprising, Henry Tudor escaped capture, fleeing back to Brittany with renewed resolve. Richard knew this was not the end. Henry would return, and with him the specter of a united opposition. The king's paranoia grew. He fortified his defenses, rewarded loyalists with titles and lands, and kept a wary eye on every noble in his court, suspecting betrayal at every turn. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Henry Tudor was not idle. In the courts of Brittany and later France, he gathered support, weaving a coalition of Lancastrian exiles, disgruntled Yorkists, and foreign mercenaries. His mother, Margaret Beaufort, worked tirelessly from within England, conspiring with powerful figures like Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley, whose allegiance could tip the balance of power. Henry's promise was simple yet potent. He would unite the warring houses of York and Lancaster by marrying Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's eldest daughter, thus healing the rift that had torn England apart for decades. This pledge won him allies among those weary of endless conflict, even as Richard scoffed at Henry's tenuous claim, deriding him as a pretender with no real right to the throne. But Richard underestimated the power of hope and hatred. Every execution, every harsh decree, drove more men into Henry's camp, men who saw in the exiled Tudor a chance to end the reign of a king they deemed a tyrant. By 1485, the tension had reached a boiling point. Richard's personal life, too, was unraveling, adding to his mounting troubles. In April 1484, his only legitimate son, Edward of Middleham, died at the age of 10, a devastating blow that left Richard without a direct heir and shook his confidence. Less than a year later, in March 1485, his wife, Anne Neville, succumbed to illness, likely tuberculosis, at the age of 28. Rumors swirled that Richard had poisoned her to clear the way for a marriage to his niece, Elizabeth of York, a baseless accusation but one that further eroded his reputation. Grief-stricken and increasingly isolated, Richard faced a kingdom on the brink of revolt. Spies brought word that Henry Tudor was amassing an army in France, backed by King Charles VIII, who saw an opportunity to weaken England by supporting a rival claimant. Richard prepared for war, summoning his loyalists and fortifying key strongholds, but doubt gnawed at him. Could he trust his allies? Would his army stand firm against a determined foe? On the 7th of August, 1485, the inevitable arrived. Henry Tudor landed at Milford Haven in Wales with a force of around 2,000 men, a mix of French mercenaries, Welsh supporters, and English exiles. His march through Wales gathered momentum as local lords, sensing the wind of change, pledged their allegiance. Richard, based in Nottingham, rallied his own army, estimated at 8,000 to 12,000 men, a larger force on paper but one riddled with uncertain loyalties. Key figures like Lord Stanley and the Earl of Northumberland held vast retinues, yet their commitment to Richard was questionable. Stanley, in particular, was Henry's stepfather through marriage to Margaret Beaufort, a connection that made his true intentions murky. As the two armies converged near Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, the stage was set for a confrontation that would end in unimaginable bloodshed. Richard, clad in armor and bearing the weight of a crown he had fought so hard to keep, rode out to meet his fate, unaware that the battle ahead would not just decide a throne but carve his name into history as a symbol of brutal defeat. The air was thick with tension as the two forces prepared to clash on the 22nd of August, 1485. Richard's scouts reported Henry's smaller army, giving him confidence, yet a sense of foreboding lingered. He had fought in battles before, had faced death, and emerged victorious. But this felt different. Betrayal loomed as a specter on the horizon. Would his lords stand by him, or would they turn at the critical moment? For Henry, this was a gamble of everything he had. For Richard, it was a fight for survival. What unfolded on that muddy field would shock even the most hardened warriors of the age. a descent into savagery that would leave a king's body broken and a kingdom forever changed. The morning of the 22nd of August, 1485, dawned over Bosworth Field in Leicestershire, a seemingly unremarkable stretch of rolling countryside that would soon become the stage for one of the most brutal and decisive battles in English history. King Richard III, clad in polished armor and bearing the royal standard of the White Boar, surveyed his army of around 8,000 to 12,000 men from a vantage point on Ambion Hill. His forces outnumbered those of his rival, Henry Tudor, whose army numbered roughly 5,000 to 6,000, a motley coalition of French mercenaries, Welsh levies, and English exiles. On paper, Richard held the advantage, with seasoned troops and the weight of royal authority behind him. Yet, as the two armies faced each other across the muddy terrain, an undercurrent of uncertainty rippled through the Yorkist ranks. Richard knew that numbers alone did not guarantee victory, loyalty did, and loyalty was a fragile thing in a kingdom torn by decades of civil war. Key nobles like Lord Stanley and his brother Sir William Stanley, commanding thousands of men, had yet to declare their allegiance, their forces positioned ambiguously on the battlefield. Richard's fate hung on a knife edge, and he could feel the weight of betrayal lurking in the shadows. The battle began with a cautious exchange of artillery and archery, as both sides tested each other's resolve. Richard, a seasoned warrior despite the propaganda of physical deformity, had fought in brutal engagements before and knew the importance of decisive action. He positioned his vanguard under the Duke of Norfolk, a loyalist whose troops bore the brunt of the initial clash with Henry's forces, led by the experienced Earl of Oxford. The muddy ground, sodden from recent rains, slowed movements and turned the field into a quagmire, making every step a struggle. As steel clashed and arrows rained down, Richard watched from his elevated position, his mind racing. Henry's army, though smaller, fought with a desperate ferocity, driven by the promise of a new era. Oxford's men began to push back Norfolk's line, a worrying sign for the Yorkists. Richard's instincts told him to act, to rally his troops and crush the enemy before momentum slipped away. But he also knew the true threat lay not just in Henry's soldiers, but in the wavering loyalty of his own lords. The turning point came with a devastating blow. Norfolk, Richard's trusted commander, fell in the melee, struck down by an arrow or blade, his death sending a shockwave through the Yorkist ranks. Morale wavered, and Richard's position grew precarious. At this critical juncture, he faced a choice: hold his ground and hope for reinforcement, or risk everything in a bold strike to end the battle swiftly. Richard chose the latter, a decision born of both courage and desperation. Spotting Henry Tudor's standard in the distance, surrounded by a relatively small guard, Richard saw an opportunity to cut the head from the snake. If he could kill or capture Henry, the rebellion would collapse. Gathering a small contingent of his most loyal knights, including members of his household guard, Richard prepared for a daring charge across the battlefield, a gamble that would either secure his crown or seal his doom. He donned his helmet, adorned with a golden circlet to mark his kingship, and spurred his horse forward, determined to meet his rival face to face. What followed was a moment of raw, visceral bravery and catastrophic miscalculation. Richard's charge was a thunderous assault, cutting through enemy lines with shocking speed. Contemporary accounts, though sparse, suggest he came within striking distance of Henry, felling several of his bodyguards, including the standard-bearer Sir William Brandon, with his own lance or sword. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the king might triumph, his martial prowess on full display as he fought like a man possessed. But the tide turned with brutal inevitability. Lord Stanley, whose forces had lingered on the sidelines, made his choice at last, not for Richard, but for Henry, his stepson. Stanley's troops, numbering in the thousands, surged into the fray, slamming into Richard's flank with devastating force. Sir William Stanley's men joined the assault, encircling Richard's small band. Isolated and outnumbered, the king's charge became a death trap. His horse, bogged down in the marshy ground near a place later called Redamore, stumbled or was killed, leaving Richard to fight on foot, surrounded by enemies who smelled blood. The final moments of Richard III's life were a descent into unimaginable horror, a scene of savage violence that shocked even the hardened soldiers of the age. Stripped of his mount, Richard fought with the ferocity of a cornered beast, wielding his sword or battle axe against a swarm of attackers. Historical accounts, including those from the Tudor chronicler Polydore Virgil, describe a king who refused to yield, shouting defiance even as blows rained down upon him. But no amount of courage could withstand the sheer weight of numbers. Richard's armor, though strong, could not protect him from the relentless assault. Forensic evidence from his skeleton, discovered in 2012 under a Leicester car park, paints a chilling picture of his end. His skull bore multiple wounds, including a devastating blow from a halberd or poleaxe that cleaved through bone, likely delivered from behind as he was overwhelmed. Another strike, possibly a sword thrust, pierced his face, while injuries to his ribs and pelvis suggest he was struck repeatedly, even after falling. These were not just killing blows, they were acts of rage, a brutal desecration of a king's body by men who hated what he represented. As Richard's lifeblood soaked into the muddy earth, his golden circlet was torn from his helmet, a symbol of monarchy defiled in the chaos. He was the last English king to die in battle, and his death marked the end of the Plantagenet dynasty, a line that had ruled for over 3 centuries. Stripped naked and slung over a horse, his body was carried to Leicester by Henry's men, exposed to public humiliation as a final insult. The brutality of his demise was not just physical, it was a deliberate message to all who dared challenge the new order. Richard III, once a warrior king who had clawed his way to power, was reduced to a broken corpse, his reign extinguished in a storm of steel and betrayal. But the story does not end with his last breath. The aftermath of Bosworth Field would reshape England, and Richard's legacy would become a battleground of its own. With the last breath of King Richard III on that blood-soaked field at Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485, the curtain fell on a dynasty that had shaped England for over 3 centuries. The Plantagenet line, a royal house forged in conquest and tempered by war, ended in a brutal, muddy slaughter, leaving behind a kingdom teetering on the edge of a new era. Richard's body, stripped of armor and dignity, was slung over a horse like a common criminal, his naked form paraded through the streets of Leicester by Henry Tudor's victorious troops. This was no mere act of transport, it was a calculated humiliation, a message to all who might dream of challenging the new claimant to the throne. Wounds still fresh, his corpse bore the marks of savage overkill, with injuries to his skull, face, and body revealing the ferocity of his enemies' hatred. According to contemporary accounts, such as those by Polydore Virgil, Richard's body was displayed publicly for 2 days at the Greyfriars Church in Leicester, allowing the townsfolk to gawk at the fallen king, proof that the old order had been shattered. Finally, he was buried in a hasty, unmarked grave within the church, a far cry from the royal tombs of his predecessors, his resting place forgotten as the years rolled on. Henry Tudor, now crowned Henry VII, wasted no time consolidating his power. His victory at Bosworth was not just a military triumph, but the foundation of a new dynasty. Tudor would rule England for over a century. On the 30th of October, 1485, Henry was coronated, and true to his promise, he married Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, in January 1486, symbolically uniting the warring houses of York and Lancaster. This union, while not immediately ending all conflict, helped to heal the deep wounds of the Wars of the Roses, offering a narrative of reconciliation that Henry's propagandists eagerly promoted. Yet, Henry's reign began under the shadow of Richard's death. To legitimize his claim, he and his supporters set about vilifying Richard, portraying him as a tyrant, a usurper, and a murderer of innocents, most notably the princes in the Tower. This blackening of Richard's name was not just political expediency. It was a deliberate rewriting of history to ensure that no Yorkist loyalist could rally around the memory of the last Plantagenet king. Richard became the villain of the tale, a hunchbacked monster whose evil justified his brutal end. The immediate aftermath of Bosworth saw a purge of Richard's closest allies. Those who had fought for him and survived faced attainder stripped of titles and lancer execution if they refused to bend the knee to Henry VII. The Duke of Norfolk, though already dead on the field, had his family's estates confiscated, while others, like Viscount Lovell, fled into hiding, plotting futile rebellions that flickered and died in the face of Tudor dominance. Henry's reign was marked by paranoia, a lingering fear of Yorkist resurgence, and he crushed any whisper of dissent with an iron hand. The Stanley brothers, whose betrayal had turned the tide at Bosworth, were richly rewarded. Lord Stanley was made Earl of Derby, his loyalty to Henry cemented by titles and influence. Yet, even as Henry built his new order, the memory of Richard's brutal death lingered, a grim reminder of the cost of power in a fractured kingdom. The battlefield itself became a place of quiet infamy, its exact location debated for centuries, until modern archaeology pinpointed the site farther from Ambion Hill than once thought, a testament to how even the ground of such a pivotal event could fade into obscurity. Richard's legacy, however, proved far more enduring and contentious than his unmarked grave suggested. For centuries, the Tudor narrative dominated, amplified by chroniclers like Thomas More and, most famously, William Shakespeare, whose play Richard III cemented the image of a deformed, malevolent king, a bottled spider who schemed and murdered his way to the throne. Shakespeare's portrayal, written over a century after Bosworth under the patronage of a Tudor queen, Elizabeth I, was a masterpiece of propaganda, turning Richard into a caricature of evil whose brutal death seemed a fitting end. Lines like, a horse, my kingdom for a horse," dramatized his final desperation, embedding in popular culture a vision of a king undone by his own villainy. Yet this image was not the full truth. Richard's short reign had seen reforms, legal protections for the poor, efforts to curb corruption that hinted at a more complex ruler, one shaped by the brutal necessities of his time rather than inherent malice. The mystery of the princes in the Tower, while damning, remains unsolved, with some historians arguing Richard may not have ordered their deaths, pointing to other culprits or even Henry VII himself. The rediscovery of Richard's remains in 2012 under a Leicester car park marked a turning point in how we view his story. Forensic analysis confirmed the brutality of his death: multiple skull wounds, including a fatal blow likely from a poleaxe, and post-mortem injuries, suggesting his body was desecrated after death. The skeleton also revealed scoliosis, a curvature of the spine, but not the grotesque hunchback of legend, challenging centuries of caricature. This find sparked a renewed interest in Richard, with groups like the Richard III Society advocating for a reassessment of his character, arguing he was a victim of Tudor propaganda as much as of Henry's army. In 2015, Richard was reburied with honor in Leicester Cathedral, a ceremony attended by thousands, a stark contrast to his ignominious first burial. This act of restitution symbolized a shift while his death remains a brutal chapter. His life is now seen through a more nuanced lens, a king caught in the merciless gears of history. As we reflect on Richard III's end, the echoes of Bosworth Field still resonate. His death was not just the fall of a man but the violent birth of a New England, one forged in blood and betrayal. The brutality inflicted upon him both in life and in memory raises questions that linger beyond the grave. Was he the monster history branded him, or a tragic figure undone by the very forces he sought to control? How do we separate the man from the myth when the victors wrote the tale? Richard's story is a mirror to the savagery of his age, a reminder that power often comes at a horrific cost. We invite you to share your thoughts. Do you see Richard as villain or victim? What do you think history has hidden about his final, brutal moments? Let us know in the comments below as we continue to unravel the darkest corners of the past.